Hello, everyone, and welcome to our October installment of our Post-Secondary Pathways webinar series hosted by the Hunt Institute. As always, we are excited to have you all back. I am Dr. Waverly Wissenant, Deputy Director of Higher Education at the Hunt Institute. The Hunt Institute is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting and advising education leaders and policymakers nationwide on education issues across the education continuum. For today's session, we're going to focus on the power of experiential learning and how it promotes a multitude of pathways to success. As we know with our rapidly evolving workforce, experiential learning is emerging as a key player in enhancing student success, both during and after college. This webinar will explore how experiential learning, specifically through internships, apprenticeships, service learning, and hands-on projects, equip students with the skills and real-world experience necessary to transition seamlessly from the classroom to meaningful careers. We will delve into how higher education institutions can integrate these opportunities into curricula to increase post-secondary attainment, career readiness, and successful job placement. So I am thrilled to introduce our moderator, Laverne Srinivasan, from the Carnegie Corporation. Hopefully I did that correct or close enough, hopefully. And Laverne is the Vice President of the Carnegie Corporation's National Program and the Program Director for Education, where she oversees grant making and leads efforts to strengthen teaching, leadership, and innovative learning environments that expand K-12 pathways to college and career success. So now let me formally pass the mic to Laverne, who will lead the coming discussion and introduce our resource experts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. I'm looking forward to it. We are going to have, I hope, a lively conversation and an informative one. Just a quick couple of words about our focus at Carnegie on this very important topic. We have a two-pillar strategy at Carnegie focused on economic and social mobility on the one hand, and civic participation on the other. And in both of those areas, we focus on experiential learning is absolutely essential to helping young people not only develop the knowledge and skills they need, but know how to put those skills and that knowledge into action, whether it is in the civic space or, importantly, as we're going to talk about today, to prepare them for workforce. And so national service is a big priority for us now. It's a brand new priority under new leadership here. So you will be hearing more about that from Carnegie. We're going to have a big convening here in a couple of weeks. In addition to that, we ran an initiative called Profiles in Collective Leadership, and you can take a look at that on our website, where we really took the position that there were great things happening in communities all over this country where cross-sector collaborations between K-12 higher ed and the workplace were with leaders coming together and designing pathways to create opportunities for young people in their communities. And that was beneficial for everyone involved, for the young people, for their families, and for the businesses that participate in designing those opportunities. So as you can see, we are excited about this area and view it as a huge priority to advance economic and social mobility. So I will now turn to introducing our first speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Engel. She is a research professor and the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. I am going to ask you the very first question, Jennifer. Through leading the Raise the Bar initiative at the U.S. Department of Education, you emphasized the importance of evidence-based strategies and recognized that institutions that supported underserved students in earning credentials of value were something that the department needed to prioritize. And so I'd like to hear a little bit, if you can share with us, how can experiential learning be incorporated into these kinds of recognition and awareness efforts to encourage more institutions to adopt practices that lead to economic mobility? Dr. Engel?
Thank you so much, Laverne. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the Hunt Institute for extending the invitation today. Really glad to be part of this conversation with such great colleagues. I want to start by emphasizing why it's so important to talk about experiential and work-based learning right now. What we're seeing is that it's no longer enough to get students into college or even to help students complete a college degree. Policymakers, the public, students themselves, they're all asking, is college still worth it? And will I get a credential of value that leads to economic opportunity, mobility, prosperity for myself, my family, my community? And so that's why in the recognition efforts that you mentioned, when I was at the Department of Education in the previous administration, we really focused on equitable access, completion, and post-college outcomes, because we think that higher education has an important role in all three of those aspects. So making sure that students are earning credentials of value means doing things differently. Again, the work of the post-secondary institution isn't contained to the campus any longer. And so, helping students to proactively navigate those college to career pathways, especially through experiential learning. So I'll just briefly mention two institutions that we highlighted through our Raise the Bar initiative. We had a series of national summits, one of them focused on career pathways. One was Clemson. And what was interesting about what Clemson was doing is that they realized, by virtue of being in a rural location, that many of their students were not getting access to internship opportunities. And so they committed to offering over 900 paid internship opportunities on campus every year by partnering students with professional staff and faculty members, where they gained real world experience and that mentorship, which is really critical as well. The second one I'll mention is Arizona State University. They're doing a lot of work in this area, but one of the things they're doing is they're redesigning their federal work study program. So many students, so most of today's students are working, right? But especially our first generation students, our low income students, but they're working in order to pay to learn. They're not learning to work or how to work or be part of the work world. We know that most of those students who are working don't have jobs that are actually connected to their career interests and don't actually help them build skills that they can use in the workplace. And so Arizona State is really rethinking their federal work study program. They're ensuring that it's a more professional experience, that students are getting mentorship, peer community connections, and they're making sure that even if it's an on-campus job, they're connecting to employer projects through micro internships and other initiatives. So I'll end there for this question, but I do think there's some really good work in the field that we need to lift up, whether it's through federal, state, or other types of organizations and agencies.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Engel. Well, let's build on that and turn now to Kathleen Dulowski. So Kathleen, you're up next. Kathleen founded the Education Design Lab in 2013, and the Education Design Lab has helped 1,200 colleges, organizations, and economic regions design shorter and more affordable pathways for learners to achieve their economic goals. So, Kathleen, let's talk a little bit about an example of a pathway that the lab has supported that integrates experiential learning, and tell us a little bit about what has made that successful in helping students achieve their economic goals.
Sure. Well, the model that the lab has been, advocating and designing with colleges and regions, we're calling it micro pathways, and it's really an effort to, help colleges modularize their the learning journey, to address many of the points that Jennifer just brought up, which is that they have to work anyway, and often the goal of a 4-year degree seems far off. And so if you can weave learning and work together and gain earnings power by doing a short-term pathway that ends in a credential and then leads to a job, which then you're up the ladder salary wise, and from there you can build again. That's the step ladder approach. And we hope in many of these cases that people build to a degree, but they don't have to. And the statistics show that like 17% of people who start community college with the goal of getting a 4-year degree, like only 17% of them actually do. And so, the lab's work in this area, the micro pathways, and we're working with 130 colleges now, is to really address this. And where we can, we're building the work experience right into the pathway, or it's, you do a short-term pathway, then, you aim to get hired, but then you can come back to the learning path. So I'll give 2 examples of one of each. So in St. Paul, Minnesota, we're working with St. Paul College, which is they actually, I'm not sure whether the county approached them or they approached the county in which they live, but they have organized a route to a network security engineer that starts with a help desk internship, where you're working on the help desks for one of the county agencies while you're earning credits, and then getting paid, obviously. And then it's a 14-week program, and then you're guaranteed interviews with the county, with different agencies. And it's a large enough employer that there are enough jobs for people to be considered, and that gets them on it's that first career ladder on the rung, which we're all becoming so concerned about, particularly with AI, that those are the jobs that are going to be most at risk and harder to get. And I mean, I teach at a university now, and my students are super worried about this. How are we going to get hired if we don't already have the 2 or 3 years of experience? And this idea that you can just weave it together is what we're aiming for, at least for community colleges. I know it's harder for 4 years to do this. And then the example I have, where it's almost sort of like a boot camp model that we just announced last week with 4 of the major banks in the state of Rhode Island, and the Community College of Rhode Island. They're doing it, you do at night, while you're working in whatever your other, your original job is. You're working to, you're going to school at night for 14 weeks. And then it's only like, 1 or 2 nights a week, and it's paid for by the banks. And then you're guaranteed interviews. And then the idea is that that's a preparation course or certificate for you to become in a banking IT or a banking help desk worker. And the banks got together, and the lab facilitated this to demonstrate that, okay, what are the skills we need to bring a pipeline into our industry? And so the banks really drove this, which I thought was, excellent. So those are a couple of examples from the lab's work.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm itching already to ask you more questions, both of you, but let me first turn to our 3rd esteemed panelist that we're fortunate enough to have. I'd like to introduce Matthew Hora. Matthew is a professor of adult and higher education in the Department of Liberal Arts and Applied Studies and the Department of Education Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Hora, thank you so much for joining us. Question to you. In your research and teaching, what have you found to be the most effective ways post-secondary institutions can transform their structures, culture, and pedagogical practices to support career-integrated learning while also addressing inequality, disciplinary learning, and the goals of a liberal arts education?
So thank you for that great question, Laverne, and I'll start by unpacking a little bit because there's a lot there. And the first is the term career integrated learning, because I find in education research and policy, we often have some jargon or buzzwords that you ask 10 different people what they mean and you get 10 different answers. For career integrated learning, I like to follow the examples of some scholars in Australia to make the distinction between work-based learning, which happens, in their view, off campus. And so the question of structures, cultures, and policy are really in the hands of the employer or a host organization. That's in contrast to work integrated learning, which happens on campus, where again, questions of culture and structures pertain to the college or the university. Um, and so when it comes to how do we change or affect structure and culture to really kind of boost or scale effective work integrated learning, there's lots of research on reform implementation from K-12 and higher ed about how can we most effectively change teaching and learning. And one of the things that we found is in terms of structure, you need reward systems like recruitment, tenure, and promotion, for example, that actually rewards teaching instead of just research. If you don't reward people, promote them, and pay them for excellent teaching, you're not typically going to see it happen or a lot of energy devoted to it. You also need to have some professional development in place. Most higher ed instructors, including myself, were not formally trained how to teach, much less do the difficult work of work integrated learning or skills development. And so we need to see that. And the other related thing that we've seen in the research is that educators often learn the best when they're in a cohort or a community of learners. This is really important so people can compare notes. They can kind of ground truth what they're hearing in PD to the realities of the classroom. But it's also a way to get connected to people outside of your department, like career services, employer relations, alumni networks, which a lot of faculty are kind of stuck in their departments. When it comes to culture, which is really fascinating because I'm trained in anthropology, one of the things the research is really clear on is you need leadership. So you need people at the upper echelons of leadership talking about and making visible something like work integrated learning. Ideally, they back that up with some funding, maybe a creation of a unit, some hiring of staff. But then at the department level, what we've seen is you need people that are what they call champions or advocates for that particular reform. And in higher ed, where people of status and expertise are really well respected and influential within departments, if a champion can be a senior scholar, that really makes a difference. To answer your question about how work integrated learning can support disciplinary learning, fortunately, that's really easy because we have tons of research in the learning sciences that shows that we need contextualized, authentic problems in the classroom, not a bunch of abstract principles given to students, along with some hands-on engaged learning. Like that's the most effective way to retain knowledge and then transfer it to other contexts. And so instead of using kind of hypothetical made up real world examples, I mean, it's kind of low hanging fruit as somebody who does a lot of faculty development is to have the instructors use workplace based examples to ground their assignments, their lectures, and basically everything they do. Now, the cool thing about work integrated learning is it could also support disciplinary learning and the liberal arts missions that you mentioned. And this is happening through skill development, the transferable skills. Some people call them soft skills. There's a bunch of names. The problem is that too often in higher ed, we think of these as generic and kind of, applicable across disciplines. But we know from a lot of research, these are highly contextualized. They're really linked to disciplinary knowledge and task context. And they're not easy to teach. They need to be carefully embedded in active learning. And so this is something that can easily be done. It's just something we have to really help instructors in doing because most of us aren't trained. The last thing I'll mention is you mentioned equality. And I think this is a really under discussed element of experiential learning and work integrated learning. One of the things I found in my research on internships is there's not enough of them. The supply demand equation is really out of whack. And so that's why I and a lot of my colleagues in other countries have really been pushing work integrated learning on campus because there we have more control over scale and placement, and we can reach all students. The problem with the skills development side of this is that there's too little attention to how the way we define transferable skills can encode a lot of implicit biases and discriminatory views about what constitutes good oral communication, for example. And so one thing we have to do there is we need to teach students how to recognize how culture impacts these transferable skills and how there's no one right way to think or behave or to work in teams. And again, this gets back to training faculty and how to do this well.
Thank you, Matthew. That's fantastic. There is a lot to think about, and I did ask you a very, a very packed question there. Um, I'm going to, before we turn to audience Q&A, I'm going to ask the panelists one more question. Before I do that, it just reminds me, Matthew, one of the grantees that we have is Opportunity Insights. I'm sure all of you know Raj Chetty's work. And, you know, some of what I'm hearing you talk about is these opportunities does sort of help to account for some of the lack, often for students to social networks, or to really, these examples that you're lifting up really do make it possible for more students to have access to these types of opportunities, which we know are so crucial for economic and social mobility. So appreciate all the examples that you're sharing. So let's continue on. um, the next question I want to ask is, as we talk, and I spoke a little bit about this at the top of our conversation, in terms of work that the Carnegie Corporation has supported. I wanted to explore with each of you how you think about the role of cross-sector collaborations between educational institutions, employers, and local leadership, promoting the development and scaling of experiential learning that builds durable skills. To your point, Matthew, that a lot of different names for those skills. And how can these skills be effectively assessed, credentialed, um, for academic credit, or reflected in a skills-based resume for learners? I do know that Brandeis is looking at doing some work around this in collaboration with ETS to create a second transcript. But Dr. Engel, how about you? What are you seeing, and how do you think about this type of collaboration?
It's extremely important. If these experiences are going to be truly relevant, there needs to be that employer engagement as part of the experience. We know that top firms and companies have always recruited from so-called top colleges.
Mhm.
And so we do see, as Matthew said, there is an access issue within colleges, but also across them. So we see community colleges and comprehensive four-year institutions maybe not getting that same kind of experience or exposure, in part because we don't always have companies reaching out to that sector. Now, I think that's changing a lot, and I think especially in the community college that's changing, and we're seeing a lot of local and regional collaboration. I think internships and apprenticeships is part of where that's starting. People are thinking about apprenticeships differently. It used to be a fairly narrowly defined way to engage, but apprenticeships have a lot more um, employer engagement in the development and the implementation. And so we're seeing them applied to more and more fields of study. IBM is doing apprenticeships in cybersecurity, for instance. We're seeing, apprenticeships in advanced manufacturing with Siemens. We're seeing the Mayo Clinic doing, health technician apprenticeships, and all of these are with community colleges. And so I think there's an opportunity to engage a population that overwhelmingly is going to community college in order to improve their ability to get a job directly after their program, and in need of these experiences. Some of the features of these programs, I think, that help to your point of how do we help students communicate what they learned through these experiences. We see embedding industry credentials as part of the experience. So you're not just coming out with your associate's degree, you also have this embedded industry credential that was part of the program. Guaranteed post-graduation employment, especially if there was either a paid component or a tuition remission component as part of the industry supported program. And then learning and employment records, which are not necessarily specific to a certain industry, but we have seen certain institutions and states really lean into helping students to create a digital profile of all of their learning experiences, including these experiential learning experiences. Again, Arizona State has done a lot of work in this area. Dallas College has done a lot of work in this area. And what it allows is for students to then share and identify employers in a digital marketplace, and for employers to identify students in that same digital marketplace. And that helps to break down some of the barriers that you talked about, not having that kind of social or cultural capital, that network to draw upon. It helps to level the playing field, both by offering these kinds of work-based learning experiences with community colleges, but also ensuring that those students can compete in the talent marketplace.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Engel. I'll just remind the audience as well, after Kathleen and Matthew respond to this question, we will open it up for questions. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. Kathleen, you're next.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the reasons I'm on this panel is I just came out with a book called Who Needs College Anymore, that actually challenges higher ed really to think about these things that we're talking about and to rethink their own value proposition and their social contract in a changing world. I devote a whole chapter to it's called experience is the new degree. The idea that colleges might need to think about that they all need to bake in some version of how do you help deliver the student at the door of their first job, because they do, particularly 4 years, hate to say it, don't really see that as their job under the current the current climate or the current traditional model, let's say. And I think it is changing, and community colleges are changing faster than the 4 years. But one of the things I give 5 models of where this is starting to change and where we're seeing promise. And some of these one of the models is what you just described, Laverne, the skills transcript, the idea that you offer a second transcript. And I profiled Western Governors University,
Yeah.
which is really doing this at scale with 150,000 students or however many they have. Where the idea that every class you take, even if it's a gen ed English class, you're getting your advisor is working with you to help you translate. Well, what would that look like on your resume if you've said you want to be an HR specialist or something? So you're getting that transferable language. You're helping to learn the language of how to talk about your what you're learning in a traditional classroom. But other models that maybe to answer your question about engaging with partnerships. I profiled the University of North Dakota, which like Clemson, that was mentioned at the beginning, is in a more rural area. Not a lot of employers, but they have 14,000 students. It's the flagship in North Dakota, and they are working with this company Ripen, which is getting a lot of it's basically a matching platform that matches learners with employers for these virtual work-based experiences. And the professors are actually charged with baking it into their classrooms. And so that model is taking off quite a bit. And then the last one I'll mention, where, which really shows you what it would take for colleges and universities, particularly larger ones, to really face the employment world, as opposed to being the ivory tower. And that is Northeastern University, which is really the kind of the granddaddy of apprenticeship work-based experiences. It's what all other colleges look to as the gold standard. But they, in order to do that, because it's a co-op model where you come in and out of college, it's a true weave. It's the weave at scale, is what I say in my book. But they have 250 employer liaison staff members, which when every other college looks at that, they're like, how do we do that? So I think that really raises the question of, work-based experience in college is not funded, right? It's not, there's no funding mechanism for it. And because you can't really charge, because like Northeastern doesn't charge the students tuition when they go off to their work-based experiences. So we have to figure out the funding model with higher ed if we're going to make this work at scale.
No, that's so important, Kathleen. And I think that goes back also, Matthew, to your points about the systems and structures and culture, et cetera, that support this kind of shift in how we approach college and work and the collaborations that are possible there. So let me turn to you, Matthew, and maybe you would like to add a little bit more and share your perspective.
Yes, the funding question is essential and very complicated and fraught right now, as you all probably know. And I'd love to come back to the Ripen model and this idea of having faculty bake some of these projects into their curriculum.
Mhm.
But I'll get back to the first original question because some of my early research was on cross-organizational partnerships, especially in education, and most of them fail. The evidence is very clear in business and management. Most partnerships, when you're talking about either cross sector or cross organization, they don't work. And we found in our research, which was between school districts and different universities across the country working on math and science curriculum reform in middle schools, that it's the same. It's different workplace cultures, different goals of institutions, different understandings of terminology. Even the word curriculum means different things to different people. And so we watched in real time multiple partnerships crash and burn because of some of these things. And what they found in research on partnerships, in order to avoid this, you need things like an introductory meeting where everybody lays everything on the table. You know, what are your self-interests? What are your goals? What are your capacities? What are you willing to put on the table in terms of staffing and money? And having some mutual respect established at the very beginning is essential. But unfortunately, a lot of these things are overlooked when people launch partnerships. This is especially important, I think, with work-based learning and kind of college, university, and employer um, partnerships because they're not easy. And one of the things that I think can really help move things forward is having more of these take place, where you could have higher ed institutions helping employers design internships and apprenticeships as like robust learning models. We could have chambers of commerce, and we see this in different parts of the country, chipping in to fund unpaid internships and to work with employers about, yes, you can have one intern, here's how to do it. But again, it's hard to do, and it's going to need some support systems across the different partners. On the work integrating learning side of things, one thing I've seen work really well is at the community college level. You have a lot of curriculum advisory boards. And here in Wisconsin, it's actually required by law, where employers sit with faculty and develop curriculum on a regular basis. And so you have the curriculum and teaching methods just sort of cutting edge, and you get instructors who know where the job openings are, they know where the fields are shifting or not. And so that's one model. As long as, again, the instructors maintain autonomy and control over the classroom, which is a very fraught issue. But as long as that happens, these can be really robust models. And in 4 years, you see that a lot in professional programs like healthcare and engineering. But one of the things, because I think you mentioned skills, Laverne, one of the things we've found in our research on internships, but also just teaching and learning, is too many people assume that because you go through an internship or you go through college, that you develop all of these skills. And we know that's not true. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of really unsatisfactory, not very effective work-based learning experiences and college experiences. And so really paying attention to training the supervisors, training the faculty is something that I think we need to really do. And this gets back to this issue of funding, because this question of can students effectively translate what they've learned in college or even at a part-time job? Can they translate that to their resume? That's something I and a lot of my colleagues are seeing is very challenging for many graduating students. They don't know how to do that. And so we need instructors in the classroom say, that small group project you did, you should mention that in your job interviews. It developed team building skills and, your reasoning skills in a healthcare context. And it should be happening at the career advising stage too. The problem is right now, at some institutions, and I'll mention my own, which is a research university, at some colleges, we have one advisor for hundreds, if not thousands of students. And until and unless we start to put some money and staffing into advising and faculty development and partnership building, I am a little pessimistic about where we can advance as a field.
Well, thank you. Um, that's actually where you were heading there at the end, Matthew, kind of builds into one of the questions that I see here from the audience. And I am actually going to take the liberty for that reason of actually switching the order of the two of the questions I have here. So the first is, what metrics or indicators do you think are most effective for measuring the impact of experiential learning, not only on immediate student engagement, but also on long-term outcomes like economic mobility? So I think that's building off the point that you were making, Matthew. And it's not just the students need to understand. We need to be able to measure it. The instructors need to be engaged. The employer. So it's not a simple equation. Do you want to add anything more in response to this question?
Well, just mention that in order to isolate a variable such as an experiential learning experience, like an internship or, a course embedded project on things like wages or long-term employment outcomes would be very difficult because there's so many factors at play. I think what we're seeing in the field now is more proximal measures like skills gain or time to first job, like a more short-term measurement. That's used in a lot of research on internships around the world. But on the skills question, one of the challenges is skills are notoriously difficult to evaluate and measure. People have been trying to come up with standardized tests for critical thinking for decades. And you get people in different disciplines and they argue left and right about, whether or not they're valid and reliable. And so it's challenging, but I think places like the National Survey of Student Engagement at Indiana, they're trying, and some other scholars are trying to isolate what are the impacts of these experiences on long-term outcomes. It's just a very challenging methodological issue.
Makes sense.
Mm.
Jennifer or Kathleen, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah.
I-
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
Uh,
Jennifer.
Sure. What I was going to add is that it is certainly, to your point, Matthew, it can be difficult to isolate, the impact of a particular experience. That said, because we see from the data that low-income students, first-generation students, other underserved populations tend to earn less that first year out of college, even when they're coming out of the same program and the same institution. And so while we know there is discrimination in the labor market that is largely affecting that, especially over the long term, I feel like that's an indicator that can help you as an institution say, have we actually given those underserved populations enough opportunities to make connections with, network with, demonstrate their skills with employers in our area? Because we would expect those gaps to maybe be there 5, 10, 15 years out, given what we know about the nature of employment. But could we close that gap in the near term as a result of the bridging that these programs can help students do, especially those from underserved backgrounds? So that would be one way to look at that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Kathleen, what were you about?
Yeah, I was going to add sort of on the practical front, when we're looking at how these experiences, do they or do they not help a learner get a job? Do they create the signal in the marketplace that let's say an industry recognized, micro credential would? What we're seeing is some experiment. It's really experimentation at this point, but it's showing a lot of promise around using AI to help speed up the creation of assessments that are putting the skills in context and asking folks to basically go through an experience. Let's say you're a healthcare worker and you're simulating a hospital bedside experience, and you're demonstrating empathy or critical thinking. in the moment and in the context. That's what employers are saying to us that they want to see. And this actually is, like if the employer helps, and AI has sped up the process of creating these experiences, if AI can help us do that, we can get to assessments, post-internship, for example, assessments. I mean, you could do pre as well, but right now we're focused on how do we help these people demonstrate, okay, yes, I have mastered this skill, because that's you can say you did an internship, but what does that mean? Are you good at the thing? And right now we're mostly using like referrals or, recommendations, right? That's what, that the boss you had in the internship, what do they say about you? But it's often kind of generic. And so yeah, that's what we're working on in the marketplace right now to try to create.
One question that just based on your responses in different ways makes me wonder about the student agency, if you will, to, the point about how much does a student understand the extent to which they're developing a skill through a particular learning experience. Because we know we need obviously a way for employers to value whatever they've accomplished and done, but there's also it seems a power to students themselves understanding, well, what am I already good at, or what skills do I have, and how do I know if I engage in X, Y, or Z learning opportunity, or how to seek it out so that they can sort of map their way to achieving their goals. I wonder if anyone wants to comment on that quickly before we move on to another audience question.
I'd love to. I spend a lot of time thinking about career development theories and how we advise young people or adults changing careers. And one of the things that we still see is this assumption of a linear career, that you graduate, you get one job, and you stay in it forever. And very few people experience that. And I think one of the powers in having students really recognize, yes, I developed these reasoning or argumentation skills in my program. If they could really kind of sit with that and understand it and internalize it, it's not going to be something that they would take just to their first job after college. It's something that they can then hopefully use to kind of build their self-identity as a professional, and take, if they need to switch careers because of a huge downturn or recession, or if they just get sick of being a nurse or a teacher and they want to go into the trades. If they know what their skill sets are and really identify with them, they can transport that across careers. And so that's one of the limitations I see with a lot of assumptions and advising about careers right now. It's this focus on that first job after college with an assumption that you're going to stay in that forever. But I think we need to be giving students tools now to be more flexible in their thinking, because the disruptions we're seeing in the labor market aren't just AI. I'm a huge fan of the way Australians are thinking about this, and they look at the climate emergency similarly. They're seeing entire sectors and professions change because of fire danger or rising seas. And so there's a lot of things I think this generation of students is going to be facing uncertainty in a way that my generation didn't and hasn't.
Perfect. Anybody else have a quick response that they want to?
I think a few mechanisms that I've seen. One are courses that students take concurrent with the internship experience, so they can be actively reflecting on those skills as well as developing their job and career readiness skills. So that's kind of one. Another is having students having a job coach on site that helps them in the workplace to reflect on, not only are you showing up, clocking in, being at the job site, but are you actively engaging in the work experience and getting what you need from it?
Perfect. All right. Well, we have some questions building up here, so let me get to one of them for you all. Let's see. How have you seen institutions and policymakers balance the benefits of paid work experiences offered at colleges with the risks that they pose, particularly for students who need them most, of losing eligibility for public benefits, Pell Grants, or state institutional aid? when internships or apprenticeships are counted as earned income in financial aid calculations? And how are institutions thinking about scaling these opportunities out?
Oops. Laverne, I think we lost you in the very last.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did
um,
you hear the very end of the question? And how are institutions thinking about scaling these opportunities outside of the traditional limits of federal work-study funds?
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
I can take the last part of that question. How are institutions thinking about scaling opportunities outside of the traditional limits? And I'll let someone else answer the first part. I'm excited actually, and our entire sector, particularly the community college sector, is excited about the new passage of Workforce Pell. I think this allows for funding to really be able to scale the opportunities to do short-term pathways, which will then, I think, it brings funding into even the apprenticeship world, but it also brings funding into the kinds of opportunities that before there was, you couldn't use your Pell Grant to pay for the learning opportunity. And so now there's a little bit of money in the mix that where we can get creative around internships as well as, like the short-term pathways I talked about at the beginning, where you do a 14-week program and there's an internship tied in. There's some money that the college can broker to figure out how do we incent a business to turn that into to involve that in an internship or make it a work for credit and pay. So I think we're all looking at that and thinking it's going to bring a lot of innovation into the, let's call it, short-term credential space.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, one of the things I was surprised to learn when I was at the Department of Education is that there are a number of schools that send work study money back every year because they don't have robust work study programs set up to truly help support students to leverage these dollars. And my understanding is that work study dollars don't count. They're not part of that work penalty that is very real. That the question that was asked about the work penalty is real when it comes to students' earnings, but I believe work study earnings are not counted in that work penalty, combined with the fact that we've got schools that are sending work study money back. I think there's a bit of an information campaign that can be done to help institutions realize that these aren't just about filling service level jobs that you might have on your campus, and if you don't have the infrastructure for that, that there actually is encouragement, and it's not required, but there is in the language in the work study program encouragement to align these programs with students' career interests. So I think there's actually an untapped opportunity with federal work study, even as we see some limitations with work penalties as it relates to needs-based aid.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer and Kathleen. Let's take another one. How about, let's see here. Can you talk more? Yes, we'll do this one. Can you talk more about the linkages between the post-secondary institutions and the secondary schools? In the past, when I worked in workforce development, we received lots of feedback about how potential apprentices and interns were not prepared with academic and soft skills. And the post-secondary institution and the employers had to spend time and effort to bring them up to speed before they were employable. Are there current models, secondary and post-secondary institutions that are partnering effectively? Who would like to take a stab at that one?
I mean, I think the most grassroots and populist thing going on in this space is dual enrollment, right? I think everyone has been surprised to see that 2.5 million high school students today are dually enrolled in high school and college, and I think that and those of us in the kind of design, the curriculum and structural design space are saying, okay, well, this tells us that consumers are voting with their feet and they're asking us to redesign the end of high school, right? If they're trying to either get a job-ready credential in high school, or they are trying to get a jump on, college tuition. And in either case, or maybe they're trying to do both. And in either case, it's right now it's like random acts of dual enrollment, right? So we don't have there's not intentionality, and I think this is a huge area for states and and the federal, but mostly colleges and high schools. It's bringing them together. I just met with the high schools and college in my area to kind of look at how do we work with employers to really make these to create the kind of the weave learning experiences that I talked about earlier. So I think that's actually really exciting that dual enrollment has taken off to the extent that it has.
Terrific. Let me see if I can get another one in. Dr. Hora mentioned that chambers are raising funds for internships in their communities. Could he provide information about a chamber that he would consider a best practice in this regard that other chambers could replicate?
So in some recent policy analysis we did about unpaid internships, we came across, I'm forgetting the county, but it was in upstate New York and also in Florida near Miami. If you want to get in touch with me, just send me an email and I can hunt down those chambers. But what they were doing was actively reaching out to their membership and saying, we have a multifaceted problem here. You need more workers. Our businesses need to thrive more, and our educational institutions want more contacts for their students. But unpaid internships are not working for too many students. And so what they were doing is fundraising with state governments, with philanthropic organizations. They were trying to have some more well-off employers chip in to a fund to help fund some of these unpaid interns. And if I recall correctly, they were focused on small businesses too, because as we all know, most of the companies in our country are small and medium sized, and many of them don't have the capacity to really staff, mentors and supervisors to train a young person and take them out of a production line or whatever their main job is. And so part of their focus was to help train supervisors at the job site so that they could expand the capacity. And it struck me as like a really great model because the chambers are typically well respected and they're dialed into the employer community in a way that higher education is not.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm going to squeeze this one last one in, Waverly. Focusing on the humanities, any thoughts on integrating workforce development and/or documenting skills gained in these particular classes for work? Who'd like to address that question?
Well, I can take a stab at it because we work on at the lab. One of the key areas is how do you capture informal learning and that make up durable skills, hard skills. I think now we want to call, I'm sorry, soft skills. Now we want to call them human skills because it's sort of the differentiating skills that are not, the artificial world needs humans to manage, right? And so I know, one of the things that we're trying to do is to look at, I mean, I'm an English poli-sci major, right? So I'm all for keeping the humanities alive. But one of the things that we recognize is very much the topic of this webinar, which is work-based experience. The people in humanities majors, they can't get the internships, they can't get these work-based experiences because they're not sought after by employers because there's no connection point, right? And I teach in the Honors College at George Mason University, and my students, and I have all majors, and the cyber students, the nursing students, the teaching students, they have a plan, right? And then my English majors, my studio art majors, they got nothing in the way of internships. And it's so I think what many of us, like at my university, are trying to do is to think about how do we draw those connections into those careers and help what are the careers and how do you get like maybe a micro credentials in a quote hard skill that could make you job ready in a field, even if it's not going to be your field of dreams. but it's it's a way to get that experience that we're all saying that we need. So I think I'm teaching a course actually next semester on that called How to Get Hired in the Age of AI, that is, specifically looking at this, how can how can non-technical majors use their skills to land jobs, and by asserting their their new human superpower skills, right, in the age of AI.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.
If I
Not-
could just
yeah.
chime in if we have a second,
Sure.
I agree
Yes.
with Kathleen. Humanities students definitely need that one technical skill to get a hook into the labor market.
Mhm.
The other thing is employers want these competencies. It's just too often students don't know how to translate them. And then the third thing, too many arts and humanities and social science faculty I find really don't know what the labor market is outside of academia. And they need to really activate their alumni networks to figure out where their graduates are going.
Thank you so much. Well, Kathleen, Matthew, and Jennifer, thank you so much for all of these insights. I think it is 100% clear, based on everything you said, that we've established that this experiential learning opportunity is something that we believe and hope most students should have an opportunity to experience. And yet, as you all noted, there are challenges in making that happen, which is where I always lean into really the importance of designing and thinking about how you integrate and implement these things in a way that is really thoughtful about the stakeholders involved, the systemic implications, who are the parties that need, what are the policies, the funding sources, the communication, the professional development skills. There is a lot that goes in, the incentives that you mentioned, Matthew. There's a lot that needs to be considered as you design and implement these types of solutions. And I would, to your very good point, Matthew, about a lot of partnerships not succeeding, same is true for M&A as well. A lot of mergers and acquisitions don't succeed. Um, but that careful, thoughtful, upfront design and planning is critical to try to anticipate some of the potential pitfalls, and agreeing, as you said up front, and setting sort of the groundwork for a successful partnership or relationship could make all the difference. So I think we can get there. We can get there for most students if we can have the will and the focus to design and implement with the greatest care and quality, to understanding how implementation takes place and succeeds and doesn't fail. With that, I am going to thank you all again for joining us, and to the Hunt Institute for having us, and to our audience for being here.
Thank you, thank you. And I wish we could keep this conversation going, but we are almost at time. So again, let me reiterate, thank you all for joining us in today's engaging and informative discussion. Before closing today's discussion, the Hunt Institute will share out our links for our upcoming webinars. Our Post-Secondary Pathway December webinar will be on Pathways to Success, so navigating gainful employment in higher education. And that webinar will be on Thursday, December 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And as a reminder, we post our webinars on our YouTube page. If you subscribe to our channel, you automatically get updates on when those webinars are uploaded. And again, many thanks for joining us today. We hope to see you all again in December. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.